He stood in my bedroom at 2 a.m., silhouetted against the moonlight, his breath ragged as if he'd run a mile just to be there. I should have screamed, called the cops, but I didn't, because I'd left the window cracked on purpose, hoping he'd take the hint after that charged glance over the backyard fence. What started as innocent neighborly chats had twisted into something forbidden, electric, and now here he was, risking everything for one stolen moment. He stood in my bedroom at 2 a.m., silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through my window, his breath ragged as if he'd run a mile just to be there. The floorboards beneath his feet creaked softly, a sound that should have terrified me, a stranger in my room in the dead of night. I should have screamed, called the cops, done anything a rational person would do when faced with an intruder, but I didn't. Because deep down, in the part of my heart I'd been trying to silence for weeks, I'd left that window cracked on purpose, hopping against hope that he'd take the hint after that charged glance we'd shared over the backyard fence just hours earlier. What had started as innocent neighborly chats, the kind small-town folks engage in over morning coffee and borrowed lawn equipment, had twisted into something far more complex, forbidden, and undeniably electric. The air between us crackled with an energy I'd never experienced before, a magnetic pull that defied every lesson I'd learned about right and wrong in this conservative corner of Texas. My name's Ryan, 22 years old, back home in this quiet Texas suburb for what was supposed to be a peaceful summer break from college. The plan had been simple: help my parents around the house, work part-time at the local bookstore, maybe catch up with old high school friends who hadn't scattered to the four winds yet. Instead, I found myself caught in the most intense emotional whirlwind of my young life, all because of the man who'd moved in next door. Alex had appeared in our neighborhood 3 months ago, like a character stepping out of a romance novel I was too embarrassed to admit I'd read. He was 23, worked at Martinez Auto Repair on the other side of town, and possessed a smile that could disarm anyone, including the elderly Mrs. Henderson who'd been suspicious of every new neighbor for the past decade. There was something about the way he carried himself, confident yet humble, that drew people in. His dark hair caught the sunlight just right when he worked in his yard, and his laugh, God, his laugh could make even the grumpiest person crack a smile. Our first real conversation happened over borrowed tools, of all things. He'd knocked on our front door on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, sweat beading on his forehead, wearing a faded AC/DC t-shirt that clung to his athletic frame. "Sorry to bother you," he'd said, flashing that disarming smile, "but I'm trying to fix my motorcycle and I need a socket wrench. The hardware store's closed for lunch." I'd offered to help him find what he needed in Dad's extensive tool collection in the garage. As I handed him the wrench, our fingers brushed, just the briefest contact, skin against skin, but it sent an electric shock through my entire nervous system. That spark was undeniable, crackling between us like lightning in a summer storm. I saw something flicker in his green eyes, a recognition of the same electricity I was feeling. But just as quickly he pulled back, thanking me politely and professionally, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. In a town where church billboards lined every major street, preaching about traditional family values and the importance of staying on the righteous path, we both knew better than to acknowledge what we'd felt. This was the kind of place where deviation from the norm was met with whispered prayers and worried phone calls between neighbors. Yet despite the unspoken rules that governed our small community, neither of us could forget that moment. Over the following weeks, our conversations gradually deepened beyond the surface-level pleasantries typical of neighbor relationships. He'd lean against the chain-link fence that separated our backyards during the cooler evening hours, when the Texas heat finally released its stranglehold on the day. We'd talk about everything and nothing: work, family, dreams, fears, the books I was reading for my literature classes, the classic cars he loved to restore. He shared stories of his strict upbringing, painting a picture of a household ruled by rigid expectations and unwavering tradition. His father was a Vietnam veteran who ran their home like a military operation, believing that discipline and conformity were the keys to a successful life. His mother was a soft-spoken homemaker who quoted Bible verses like they were immutable laws of physics, sprinkling scripture into everyday conversation with the casual ease of someone who'd been doing it her entire life. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't expected, sharing details about my art major that I usually kept to myself around here. In this town, pursuing art was seen as impractical at best, frivolous at worst. But Alex listened with genuine interest as I described my painting techniques, my favorite artists, the way color and light could convey emotions that words couldn't capture. He asked thoughtful questions that showed he was really hearing me, not just waiting for his turn to speak. One particularly warm evening in late June, he appeared at the fence carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from the field behind the neighborhood. "These are for your folks," he said, but his eyes never left mine. There was something in his gaze, intense, searching, hopeful, that made my breath catch in my throat. Maybe you could put them in a vase for your mom, he added, though we both knew that wasn't really what this was about. As I reached through the fence to accept the flowers, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Windows always open at night during summer, right? The question seemed innocent enough. After all, plenty of people left windows open to catch the evening breeze in Texas heat. But the way he said it, the deliberate weight behind the words, suggested something entirely different. I laughed it off, making some joke about the broken air conditioning in our old house. But that night, as I prepared for bed, I found myself deliberately leaving the window unlatched, not opened wide, just cracked enough that someone determined enough might be able to work it open from the outside. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was reading too much into innocent conversation, but my heart hammered against my ribs as I lay in the darkness, listening to every small sound the night brought. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I began to convince myself I'd imagined the subtext in his words, that my own hopeful thinking had created meaning where none existed. But on the 4th night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, the soft scrape of the window sliding open wider, followed by the careful, measured sounds of someone climbing through. When I opened my eyes and saw him there, standing uncertainly in the rectangle of moonlight that fell across my bedroom floor, my first instinct wasn't fear, it was relief. Relief that I hadn't imagined the connection between us, that the magnetic pull I felt wasn't one-sided, that someone else in this suffocating town understood what it meant to want something you couldn't have. I couldn't stay away, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion and uncertainty. I tried, but I kept thinking about you, about us talking over the fence, about the way you really listen when I speak. I've never had that before. We talked until dawn, sitting on my bedroom floor with our backs against the wall, voices kept low to avoid waking my parents down the hall. The conversation flowed like water finding its level, covering everything from our deepest dreams to our most persistent fears. He told me about the pull he felt toward me, something he'd never experienced with such intensity before. I confessed the same, how thoughts of him had begun to occupy every quiet moment of my days. He admitted, his voice barely audible in the pre-dawn darkness, that he'd never acted on feelings for guys before. The admission hung between us like a confession in a church pew, heavy with the weight of years of suppression and self-denial. He'd grown up in a world where such feelings were not just discouraged, but completely forbidden, where the very thought of them was grounds for family exile and social ostracism. I shared my own parallel struggle, the fear that had kept me isolated even in the more liberal environment of college, the way I'd learned to deflect questions about dating and relationships with jokes and subject changes. I thought I was the only one in this whole town, I whispered, the only one who felt different, who wanted something that couldn't exist here. As the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the window, painting the room in shades of gold and amber, he prepared to leave. But before slipping back out the way he'd come, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and placed it on my nightstand. "This is real," the note read in his careful handwriting. "What I feel for you, it's the most real thing I've ever experienced." My heart raced long after he disappeared into the early morning light. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in this struggle. Someone else understood the weight of hiding, the exhaustion of pretending, the desperate longing for authentic connection in a world that demanded conformity. The days that followed blurred together into a kaleidoscope of stolen moments and secret meetings. We developed an intricate system of communication, subtle signals, carefully timed encounters, and coded language that allowed us to maintain the facade of casual friendship while nurturing something far deeper underneath. We'd meet at the old park on the outskirts of town after dark, when the streetlights barely penetrated the canopy of ancient oak trees that provided perfect cover for our clandestine encounters. There, hidden from prying eyes and judgment, we'd sit on weathered picnic tables and talk for hours, our hands occasionally brushing under the star-studded Texas sky, sharing kisses that felt like acts of defiance against a world determined to keep us apart. During one of these midnight meetings, Alex opened up about his past in ways that revealed the depth of pain he'd been carrying. He told me about his junior year of high school, when he developed intense feelings for a teammate on the football team, a quarterback named Josh with sun-bleached hair and an easy confidence that Alex found irresistible. "I thought maybe he felt something too," Alex confessed, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of highway traffic. "The way he'd find excuses to touch my shoulder during practice, how he'd always partner with me during drills. I finally worked up the courage to tell him how I felt after we won the regional championship. We were all celebrating, high on victory and teenage invincibility." The story didn't end well. Josh's reaction had been swift and brutal, not just rejection but public humiliation. By Monday morning, whispers followed Alex through the hallways like persistent shadows. Teammates who'd been friends suddenly found reasons to avoid him. Coaches started benching him for minor infractions. The isolation was complete and devastating. I learned to hide after that, Alex said, his voice breaking with the weight of old pain. I learned to laugh at the right jokes, date the right girls, say the right things. I became an expert at being someone I wasn't, and after a while I almost convinced myself that person was real. I shared my own parallel story, coming out to my closest friend during freshman year of college, a guy named David who I'd trusted completely. I'd chosen my words carefully, picked the perfect moment, and opened my heart with the naive belief that friendship could overcome prejudice. Instead, I'd faced awkward silences that stretched into weeks, then months. David had gradually distanced himself, finding excuses to avoid our usual hangouts, until our friendship simply withered away like a plant left untended. The worst part wasn't losing him, I told Alex as we sat shoulder to shoulder on that picnic table. It was the way he made me feel like I was the problem, like my feelings were something dirty that had contaminated our friendship. I started to believe that maybe love like ours really was wrong, that maybe I should just learn to live without it. But as our secret relationship deepened, those old wounds began to heal. We discovered that what we felt for each other was the opposite of wrong. It was the most right thing either of us had ever experienced. Our connection transcended physical attraction, though that was certainly present. We found in each other a perfect complement. His mechanical aptitude balanced my artistic sensibilities. His steady pragmatism grounded my tendency toward emotional intensity. However, the tension of living double lives began to build like pressure in a steam engine. My best friend Mike, who I'd known since childhood, started noticing my distracted behavior, the way I'd suddenly disappear in the evenings, the secret smiles that would cross my face when I thought no one was looking. "Come on, man, who's the girl?" he'd joke, nudging me with his elbow during our usual hangouts at the local coffee shop. "You've got that lovesick look written all over your face. Someone's got you hooked, and I want details." I dodge his questions with practiced evasiveness, changing the subject or making jokes about being too focused on summer work to think about dating. But Mike was persistent, and his curiosity was becoming harder to deflect with each passing day. Meanwhile, Alex and I were growing closer despite the obstacles. One night, parked in his truck on a deserted country road outside town, he pulled me close for a kiss that was deeper, more passionate than any we'd shared before. The windows fogged as we held each other, and for a moment the rest of the world ceased to exist. "I want this us," he whispered against my lips, his hands tangled in my hair. "I want to stop hiding, stop pretending. When I'm with you, I feel like the person I was always meant to be." The words sent electricity through my entire body, but they also brought a crushing wave of reality. "What if your family finds out?" I asked, voicing the fear that haunted both of us. "What if my family finds out? What if the whole town finds out?" His face darkened with familiar anxiety. He told me stories about his father's reactions to anything that deviated from his strict moral code. There was the cousin who'd been completely disowned for being gay, erased from family photos and never spoken of again except in hushed, disapproving tones. There was the neighbor who'd been ostracized after getting divorced, treated like a pariah at community events. "I can't lose them," Alex said, but his voice lacked conviction, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "They're all I have. My whole life is built around this family, this community, if they reject me." We promised each other that we'd be careful, that we'd keep our relationship secret until we could figure out a way forward. But even as we made those promises, cracks were beginning to show in our carefully constructed facade. The strain of living a lie was taking its toll on both of us, manifesting in sleepless nights, distracted days, and a constant undercurrent of anxiety that colored every interaction with our families and friends. Still, we persevered, stealing moments wherever we could find them, holding hands in the shadows behind the old grain silo, sharing quick kisses in the alley between the pharmacy and the hardware store, building something beautiful yet fragile in the spaces between judgment and acceptance. The first real blow to our carefully constructed secret came from the person I'd trusted most in the world. Mike had been my best friend since elementary school, the guy who'd been there through every major milestone of my life: first day of middle school, driver's license test, high school graduation, even helping me pack for college. If anyone should have understood and supported me, it should have been him. But small-town loyalty, I learned, has its limits. One night in early July, after a few too many beers at his place while his parents were out of town, I made the mistake of confiding in him. The alcohol had loosened my tongue and clouded my judgment, and the weight of keeping such a massive secret had become unbearable. I'd sworn him to absolute secrecy, made him promise on our decades of friendship that he wouldn't breathe a word to anyone. "I trust you more than anyone," I'd said, looking him directly in the eyes. "You're the only person I feel safe telling this to. You know me better than anyone. You know this doesn't change who I am." Mike had seemed supportive in that moment, even progressive. He talked about how times were changing, how love was love, how he just wanted me to be happy. I'd felt such relief, such gratitude to finally have someone in my corner, someone who knew the truth and still accepted me. But days later, the rumors started spreading through town like wildfire in drought conditions. It began with whispers at the local diner, Mrs. Patterson leaning across the counter to share gossip with the waitress, their voices low but their glances pointed in my direction when I walked in for my usual morning coffee. Then came the stares from neighbors who'd known me since I was in diapers, their expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval to outright hostility. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow when I finally confronted Mike about it. I'd cornered him behind the gas station where he worked part-time, my anger and hurt spilling over into accusations I'd never thought I'd have to make against my oldest friend. "How could you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with rage and disappointment. "You promised me. You looked me in the eye and promised you wouldn't tell anyone." His response shattered what remained of our friendship. "I was worried about you," he said, but his tone was defensive rather than concerned. "This isn't normal here, Ryan. People are talking, and not in a good way. I thought maybe if enough people knew, you'd realize you need help. There are counselors who can fix this kind of thing." The casual cruelty of his words, the implication that my feelings were a disease that needed curing, that my authentic self was something broken that required fixing, cut deeper than any physical wound could have. This was someone who'd known me my entire life, who'd seen me at my best and worst, who I'd trusted with my deepest secrets. And he decided that his discomfort with my truth was more important than our lifelong bond. "It's not normal here," he'd spat when I pressed him further, his mask of concern slipping to reveal the prejudice underneath. "Maybe in your fancy college town, but not here. People have standards." I cut him off completely after that confrontation, but the damage was already done. The whispers had reached the right ears, traveled through the right social networks, and soon everyone who mattered in our small community knew about the Barrett boy and his unnatural feelings. Alex panicked when the rumors reached his circles. "My dad heard something at the hardware store," he texted me one Thursday afternoon, the message cryptic but loaded with terror. "We need to stay away from each other for a while." Then he ghosted me completely, no responses to texts, no late-night visits, no acknowledgement of my existence when we accidentally crossed paths in public. I spiraled into a darkness I'd never experienced before. Was this love really one-sided? Had I pushed too far, too fast? Had I imagined the depth of connection we'd shared, built it up in my mind into something it wasn't? The weight of societal disapproval pressed down on me from all sides, those billboards with their messages about biblical marriage, the sermons I could hear drifting from the church across the street during Sunday services, the sidelong glances from neighbors who'd once treated me like family. Then my own family's world exploded. Dad found a text from Alex on my phone during what he claimed was a routine check for inappropriate content, something he'd threatened to do but never followed through on until that moment. The text itself was innocent enough, just Alex saying he missed our conversations, but Dad's radar for anything unusual was apparently more finely tuned than I'd realized. "This is disgusting," Dad yelled, his face red with anger and what I recognized as fear. "Under my roof, with everything we've taught you about right and wrong." He didn't just ask me to leave, he ordered me out for the night, unable to even look at me as he spoke. Mom's reaction was different but equally painful. She didn't yell, instead she cried deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Through her tears, she begged me to pray it away, to seek counseling, to find some way to return to the son she thought she'd raised. "This isn't God's plan for you," she whispered, clutching her Bible like a lifeline. I crashed at my cousin Sarah's apartment that night, the only family member who lived far enough away from the neighborhood gossip network to offer neutral ground. Sarah was 5 years older than me, had moved to Austin after college, and represented everything I hoped to become: independent, confident, unapologetically herself. "Want to talk about it?" she asked as she made up the couch for me, her tone carefully neutral. I broke down and told her everything, about Alex, about Mike's betrayal, about my parents' reaction, about feeling like an alien in my own hometown. She listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me pour out months of suppressed emotion. "You know," she said when I finally finished, "there's a whole world out there where people like you, people like us, can be exactly who we are without apology. This town isn't the whole universe, even though it feels like it sometimes." It was the first time anyone in my family had ever hinted at understanding, at acceptance, at the possibility that my feelings might be valid rather than something to be cured or hidden. But even Sarah's support couldn't ease the agony of Alex's continued silence. A week passed without any contact, then 2 weeks. I began to wonder if I'd lost him forever, if the pressure from his family had convinced him that whatever we'd shared wasn't worth the cost. Then on a humid Saturday night in mid-July, I received a text. "Meet me at the park, please, I need to explain." The park looked different that night, more desolate somehow, as if it knew the heartbreak that was about to unfold there. Alex was already waiting when I arrived, sitting alone on the swing set we'd claimed as our own during happier times. Even in the dim light, I could see that he'd been crying. His usually bright eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his confident posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone carrying an unbearable weight. "I'm sorry," were the first words out of his mouth, barely audible over the distant hum of air conditioners working overtime against the Texas heat. "I'm so sorry for disappearing, for leaving you to deal with all of this alone. I wanted to reach out, wanted to be there for you, but I was terrified." He told me about the confrontation with his father, how the old man had stormed into Alex's room with rumors he'd heard at the American Legion Hall, how he demanded answers with the authority of someone used to unquestioning obedience. Alex had tried to deflect, to minimize, to explain away the gossip as small-town nonsense, but his father had pressed, and eventually, the truth had come spilling out. "I told him I loved you," Alex said, his voice breaking on the words. "I couldn't keep lying, couldn't keep pretending that what we have is something shameful. But the way he looked at me afterward, like I'd become a stranger, like I was something disgusting he'd found on the bottom of his shoe." The aftermath had been brutal. His father had threatened to cut off all financial support, to kick him out of the house, to disown him just as he had his cousin years before. His mother had alternated between tears and prayers, begging him to reconsider, to think about the family's reputation, to remember everything they'd taught him about right and wrong. "I love you," Alex continued, and my heart soared for just a moment before he delivered the crushing blow, "but I can't face losing everything. My job, my family, my entire life, it's all connected to this place, these people. Without them, I have nothing." It felt like rejection disguised as explanation, unrequited love dressed up in practical concerns. Despite everything we'd shared, despite the depth of connection we'd discovered, despite the promises and the passion and the profound understanding we'd found in each other, it wasn't enough to overcome the weight of social pressure and family expectations. We parted that night in mutual agony, him retreating to the safety of his family's expectations, me left to face the wreckage of my own family relationships and social standing. The worst part was understanding his position even as it destroyed me. In a place like this, being true to yourself could cost you everything you'd ever known. Alone with my pain, I hit rock bottom harder than I'd ever imagined possible. Sleepless nights became the norm as I replayed every moment of our relationship, the joy of discovery, the terror of exposure, the devastating betrayal by people I'd trusted. Mike's words echoed endlessly in my mind, society's stereotypes and assumptions branding us as wrong, unnatural, diseased. The isolation was almost unbearable. My parents had instituted a policy of cold politeness, speaking to me only when necessary, treating me like a guest in my own home rather than their son. Dad couldn't make eye contact during our few interactions, while Mom oscillated between teary-eyed disappointment and desperate attempts to engage me in conversations about getting help. One evening, after nearly 2 weeks of this domestic purgatory, I decided I couldn't take the silence anymore. I found Mom in the kitchen, methodically washing dishes that were already clean, a nervous habit she'd had since I was little. "We need to talk," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. "Really talk, not just pretend everything's normal while we all slowly die inside." What followed was the most honest conversation I'd ever had with either of my parents. Mom set down her dish rag and really looked at me for the first time since Dad's discovery. What she saw seemed to surprise her, not the corrupted stranger she'd been imagining, but her son, tired and hurting but still fundamentally the same person she'd raised. "I don't want you to be hurt," she finally admitted, her voice small and scared. "This world isn't kind to people who are different. I've seen what happens to families who go through this, the judgment, the isolation, the way people turn their backs on you. I'm terrified of what your life will be like." It was fear speaking, not hatred. Fear born from ignorance, from a lifetime of being taught that deviation from the norm led inevitably to suffering and damnation. But for the first time, she was willing to listen when I explained that hiding who I was had caused far more pain than being authentic ever could. "The hurt you're worried about," I told her, "I'm already living it. Every day I pretend to be someone I'm not. Every time I have to bite my tongue when you ask about girlfriends. Every moment I spend hiding the most important part of myself. That's the real suffering." Meanwhile, Alex's situation had become equally untenable. His father had made good on his threats, cutting off financial support and making Alex's home life a daily nightmare of disappointed silences and religious interventions. Church elders had been invited to the house for counseling sessions that felt more like interrogations. His mother had arranged blind dates with suitable young women from the congregation, each more awkward and forced than the last. But something had shifted in Alex during our separation. The forced isolation had clarified things for him, made him realize that losing himself was a higher price than losing his family's approval. He reached out to me in desperation one night, calling from a payphone outside a truck stop because his parents had confiscated his cell phone. "Without you, nothing makes sense," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I've been trying to go back to who I was before, but that person doesn't exist anymore. You changed me, not into something wrong, but into someone real. I can't unknow what it feels like to be authentic." The conversation lasted for hours, with Alex feeding quarters into the payphone every few minutes to keep the line connected. We talked about the cost of truth, the price of love, the question of whether happiness was worth the inevitable struggle that would come with it. "Is this worth it?" I asked him, needing to hear his answer but terrified of what it might be. "You're worth everything," he replied without hesitation. "We're worth everything. I don't know how we'll make it work, but I know I can't live without trying." The climax of our crisis came from an unexpected source, Mike's guilty conscience. Perhaps it was the weight of watching our friendship crumble, or maybe seeing how his betrayal had affected not just me, but the entire community's social fabric, but something prompted him to make a public gesture that shocked everyone who knew him. At the monthly community gathering held at the town hall, a tradition that brought together families for potluck dinners and local announcements, Mike stood up during the open comment period. The room fell silent as he approached the microphone, his usual confidence replaced by obvious nervousness. "I want to apologize to someone," he began, his voice amplified throughout the room filled with curious neighbors. "I betrayed a friend's trust, spread private information that wasn't mine to share, and I've been watching the damage spread through our community like poison." The room was completely still now, every person focused on his words. Parents paused their conversations, children stopped their games, even the volunteers in the kitchen stopped clattering dishes to listen. "Ryan Barrett is one of the best people I know," Mike continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He's kind, creative, loyal, and honest, except when people like me make honesty dangerous. I was wrong to judge him, wrong to betray his trust, and wrong to let my own discomfort dictate my actions." The speech sparked immediate controversy. Some community members applauded his honesty and courage, others were scandalized by his public acknowledgement of what they preferred to keep whispered in private corners. Mrs. Patterson stood up and walked out in protest. Several church families followed her example, but others, more than I'd expected, remained seated, some even nodding in agreement with Mike's words. The ripple effects were immediate and complex. Mike faced his own backlash for taking such a public stand. Some of his friends, particularly those from more conservative families, began distancing themselves from him. His job at the gas station became uncomfortable when certain customers made their disapproval known. He'd learned firsthand the social cost of challenging the status quo, even in the name of doing the right thing. But his gesture also forced a broader conversation that the community had been avoiding. Family dinner tables across the neighborhood became sites of difficult discussions about acceptance, judgment, and the true meaning of Christian love. Some families doubled down on their conservative positions, but others began questioning whether their prejudices were really reflective of their values. For Alex and me, Mike's public apology created both opportunity and increased scrutiny. On one hand, the secret was fully out now. There was no more pretending that our relationship was just friendship. On the other hand, we were now the center of a community-wide debate about morality, tradition, and the limits of acceptance. Alex's family situation reached a breaking point the night after the community meeting. His father, emboldened by the support he'd received from other conservative community members, issued an ultimatum: renounce his relationship with me and commit to corrective therapy or face complete exile from the family. "I choose Ryan," Alex told me later, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "I choose love over fear, truth over comfort, authenticity over approval. I can't live a lie anymore, no matter what it costs me." The decision wasn't easy or painless. Alex had to find new housing, crashing temporarily with a coworker who didn't judge him for his circumstances. His relationship with his parents became completely severed. No communication, no financial support, no acknowledgement of his existence. It was exactly the outcome he'd feared most, but he faced it with a courage that amazed me. My own family's journey toward acceptance was slower but ultimately more positive. Mom's fear gradually gave way to curiosity, then understanding. She started asking careful questions about Alex, about our relationship, about what our future might look like. Dad remained more resistant, but even he began to soften when he saw how his coldness was affecting not just me, but the entire family dynamic. "I don't understand it," Dad finally admitted during a conversation that stretched late into the night. "But I'm trying to. You're still my son, and I love you even if I don't love this situation." It wasn't unconditional acceptance, but it was a beginning. Sarah became my lifeline during this period, offering not just emotional support but practical advice from someone who'd navigated similar challenges. She told me about her own journey of self-discovery, her decision to leave the small-town environment that couldn't accommodate her authentic self, and the life she'd built in Austin among people who celebrated rather than merely tolerated differences. "Some people stay and fight to change their hometown," she said during one of our long phone conversations. "Others leave to find their chosen family elsewhere. Neither choice is right or wrong, they're just different paths to the same destination, living authentically." As summer progressed, Alex and I faced a series of difficult decisions about our future. Would we stay and continue fighting for acceptance in a community that might never fully embrace us? Would we leave together, starting over in a place where our love wouldn't be revolutionary but simply normal? Could we build a life that honored both our need for authenticity and our connections to family and community? The answers weren't simple and they couldn't be rushed, but one thing had become crystal clear through all the pain and struggle. What we felt for each other was real, valuable, and worth defending. Whether we stayed or left, whether our families eventually accepted us or maintained their distance, whether our community evolved or remained trapped in old prejudices, we would face it together. Love, we'd learned, wasn't just about the feelings between two people. It was about the courage to defend those feelings against a world determined to diminish them. It was about choosing each other repeatedly, daily, in small moments and grand gestures alike. It was about building something beautiful in the space between what is and what could be, refusing to let fear dictate the boundaries of our hearts. As August approached and my return to college loomed, Alex and I began making concrete plans for a future that would honor both our love and our dreams. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, few worthwhile things ever are, but we would travel it together, hand in hand, creating our own definition of family and home in a world that was slowly, reluctantly, learning to make space for love in all its forms. The wildflowers Alex had brought me that first evening had long since wilted and been pressed between the pages of my journal as a keepsake. But the love they'd represented had grown stronger, deeper, more resilient than either of us had dared to hope. In the end, that's what mattered most, not the approval of others, but the truth we'd found in each other. The weeks following Mike's public apology and Alex's decision to choose our relationship over his family's approval marked a period of intense transformation for both of us. It was during these early morning hours, when the town slept and we could finally be ourselves without fear of observation, that we began to truly understand what we were building together. Alex had moved into a small apartment above the auto shop where he worked, a cramped space that smelled perpetually of motor oil and possessed all the charm of a storage unit. But it was ours, the first place where we could be together openly, where we didn't have to whisper or watch the shadows for disapproving eyes. The owner, Mr. Martinez, was a pragmatic man in his 60s who cared more about Alex's work ethic than his personal life. "Love is love, Mijo," he'd told Alex when the rumors reached him. "You fix my cars good, you treat people with respect, that's all I need to know about your character." During those pre-dawn hours, we'd sit on Alex's tiny balcony overlooking Main Street, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs and planning a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. We talked about college towns where we might both fit in, about career paths that could support us independently, about the family we might create together, someday chosen family, if our biological families couldn't accept us. "I used to think love was supposed to be easy," Alex mused one morning as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. "Movies and songs make it seem effortless, natural, like breathing. Nobody talks about love that requires courage, love that demands you rebuild your entire life from the ground up." I understood what he meant. The love songs on the radio spoke of butterflies and stolen glances, not of losing friendships and facing family exile. The romantic comedies never showed couples dealing with social ostracism or the exhausting weight of constant vigilance, but what we had felt more real, more valuable, because of the struggle required to protect it. My relationship with my parents continued its slow, painful evolution during this period. Mom had begun reading books about LGBTQ+ issues, checking them out from libraries in neighboring towns to avoid local gossip. She'd approach me tentatively with questions that revealed her genuine desire to understand, even when the words came out awkwardly. "Is this something that happened to you?" she asked one morning over breakfast, "or something you've always known about yourself?" The question revealed both her ignorance and her willingness to learn, and I tried to answer with patience rather than frustration. Dad's journey was more complicated. His military background had ingrained certain beliefs about masculinity and tradition that were harder to shake. But he'd begun making small gestures, leaving articles about acceptance on the kitchen counter where I'd find them, asking careful questions about my college plans, treating Alex with grudging civility when they occasionally crossed paths in public. "I may not understand it," he told me during a rare moment of direct communication, "but I'm trying to understand you. That's got to count for something." The community's reaction continued to divide along predictable lines, but with some surprising exceptions. Mrs. Chen, who ran the Chinese restaurant, made a point of treating Alex and me with extra warmth when we ate there together. The librarian, Ms. Rodriguez, quietly recommended books that featured diverse relationships when I browsed the fiction section. Even Pastor Williams, while maintaining his theological position, had begun speaking about compassion and Christian love in ways that felt more inclusive than his previous sermons. But the opposition was equally vocal. A group of concerned parents had petitioned the school board to prevent promotion of alternative lifestyles in sex education curricula. Several local businesses displayed signs supporting traditional family values. The weekly newspaper published letters to the editor that ranged from supportive to vitriolic, turning our private relationship into a public debate about morality and community standards. Through it all, Alex and I learned to navigate our new reality with increasing confidence. We discovered allies in unexpected places. The mechanic at the competing garage who offered Alex a better job when word of his situation spread, the college-age barista at the coffee shop who slipped us free pastries with notes of encouragement, the elderly veteran at the post office who told Alex he'd served with plenty of good men who happened to be gay, and they were some of the bravest soldiers I knew. These small acts of kindness sustained us through the darker moments, reminding us that prejudice wasn't universal, that change was possible even in the most resistant environments. As my summer break neared its end, Alex and I faced the reality of a long-distance relationship complicated by family estrangement and social pressures. But we also faced it with a clearer understanding of our priorities and a deeper appreciation for what we'd found in each other. "I want to apply to colleges near yours," Alex told me one night as we lay together in his small bed, the window open to catch whatever breeze the humid night might offer. "I want to build a life where we don't have to hide, where we can just be normal people in love without it being a political statement." The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Leaving this town meant leaving everything familiar, but it also meant the possibility of a future where our love could simply exist without constant justification or defense.